You know how it is? The natural world is just, it's mind-blowingly vast.
Yeah.
Always amazing, but sometimes, honestly, a bit much, right?
Yeah.
You want to get the main ideas, the sort of logic behind it all, but maybe without, needing a PhD.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Think of this as your express route to understanding one of the most foundational works in science, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
Right.
It really is the original deep dive into how life, in all its incredible variety, actually, well, came to be.
And we're not just scratching the surface. We're really trying to pull out the crucial stuff, the big paradigm-shifting ideas Darwin presented.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission, really, is to give you a solid handle on how life diversified, how it adapted over, well, millennia. A shortcut to these huge concepts without getting totally lost in every single finch beak or fossil fragment.
We're aiming for the essence, you know?
Yeah.
The core mechanisms Darwin proposed for why the living world looks like it does, how it's all connected, and, crucially, always changing.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Darwin, he kicks things off by looking at something humans have been doing forever. Breeding animals and plants. Domestic ones.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe an odd place to start for such a huge theory. Why begin there?
It's actually a stroke of genius. He uses this familiar world, variation under domestication, to show a really powerful concept, selection.
Aye.
For centuries, we've been shaping the traits of our animals, our crops, sometimes actively, sometimes, well, passively.
Right, like dog breeders going for a specific look, or farmers picking the biggest vegetables. He calls that methodical selection. The goal is clear.
Exactly.
But then he talks about unconscious selection. What's that about? What's the difference?
That's where it gets really interesting, I think. Darwin noticed that even, say, early humans, maybe without a grand breeding plan, would naturally tend to protect the animals that were most useful or maybe easiest to handle, especially when times were tough.
Okay.
So those animals would just be more likely to survive, more likely to breed, and pass on those traits they had. So it's like selection, but without even realizing you're doing it.
Exactly. It's kind of humbling, actually, that even without trying, people were shaping the evolution of species around them. Like a sort of accidental practice run for natural selection.
He gives some pretty powerful examples of just how much we can change things this way. Someone called Watt apparently said a farmer could change it altogether, the whole nature of their livestock.
Yeah.
And Sir John Seabright, he boasted he could breed a pigeon with any feather he wanted in just 3 years. That's pretty specific.
It really shows how malleable living things are, how much they can change when you apply selective pressure over generations. Darwin also mentions, the incredibly careful breeding of merino sheep in Saxony. They treated them almost like sculptures,
Wow.
ensuring only the absolute best were bred.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting for his argument, right? These breeders, they often believed their special breeds came from totally separate wild ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
That was a stand-up thinking.
Darwin mentions asking a Hereford cattle breeder if his animals might have come from longhorns, and the guy just laughed, basically.
Yeah, the idea seemed absurd to them. Different breeds must mean different origins. But Darwin, he cleverly pushes back using domestic pigeons.
Right, the pigeons.
Despite this huge variety, fantails, powders, all sorts, they keep showing these ancestral traits. The blue color, the wing bars, just like the wild rock pigeon.
So he's saying, look, it's just really improbable that loads of different wild pigeon species all happen to have the exact same markings as the rock pigeon.
Exactly.
And that these traits would just keep popping up in all these different breeds. Unless
they all actually came from that one common ancestor, the rock pigeon.
It strongly suggests a single origin, doesn't it?
It does. He's building this case, piece by piece, that forms which look really different might actually be related. They've just branched out and changed. So the big question becomes, if human selection can do this, create all this diversity from one starting point.
What similar force could be doing that out in nature?
Precisely. What's the natural equivalent?
Okay, so we've got this powerful selection in the human world. Now, Darwin shifts focus to variation under nature and this idea of a struggle for existence. How does he connect those?
Well, first he makes the point that variation isn't just a thing with domesticated species, it's everywhere. In the wild, too.
Right.
even within populations we call a single species. And he admits, it's actually really hard to draw a perfect line between what's a full species and what's just a variety.
So those neat boxes we like to use are maybe a bit fuzzy.
Very fuzzy, often. And then, yes, comes this struggle for existence.
Sounds pretty intense.
Well, in a way, it is. It's constant pressure. Darwin, he was influenced by thinkers like de Candolle, Lyell, Herbert. He stresses that nature just produces way more offspring than can possibly survive.
There's just aren't enough resources to go around.
Exactly. Not enough food, space, everything. It leads to competition.
He uses some really amazing examples of how interconnected things are in this struggle, like cattle affecting whether Scotch fir trees grow, and insects deciding if cattle can even live wild in Paraguay. Can you explain that one?
Yeah, the Paraguay example is fascinating. There's this particular fly there that lays its eggs in the navels of newborn animals, cattle, horses, dogs.
Oh, wow.
And it often kills them. So, unlike nearby areas, these animals just can't establish large wild populations there.
The flies keep them in check.
Right, but then what keeps the flies in check? Probably insect-eating birds. And what keeps the birds in check? Maybe predators. So you change the bird numbers, and it could ripple all the way down to the cattle and plants.
It's like a chain reaction. And what about the cats, mice, and flowers thing? That sounds even more indirect.
Right, so mice destroy the nests and larvae of humblebees.
Okay.
Cats eat mice. So more cats mean fewer mice. More humblebees survive. And humblebees are really important for pollinating certain flowers, like red clover. So indirectly, the number of cats in an area could actually influence how many of those flowers grow there.
That's incredible. It shows how complex these relationships are.
It's this intricate web. And the struggle isn't just about predators. It's climate, finding food, disease, everything. He mentions seeing forests growing back on old Indian mounds, showing these long, slow ecological battles over time.
So it's this constant pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And in that situation where not everyone makes it, Darwin asks, well, what happens to the ones that have some kind of edge? Even a tiny one.
Exactly. What happens to individuals with traits that give them just a slight advantage in their particular environment, in that struggle?
And that leads us right to the core idea.
Yeah.
Natural selection. People often say survival of the fittest, so you use that phrase later, right? How does he explain it?
He introduces natural selection as the principle, the process by which any variations that are beneficial, that help an organism survive and reproduce in its environment, are well preserved, they get passed on.
And the bad variations.
And the ones that are harmful or even just less good tend to get eliminated. The individuals with them don't survive as well or don't reproduce as much.
So it's like the human breeder, but instead of a person choosing, it's nature, the environment.
Exactly. It's the overall conditions, the climate, the food sources, the predators, the competition that determine which traits are advantageous, differential survival and reproduction based on those traits.
So even something really small, like slightly better camouflage, or being a tiny bit faster.
Or being able to digest a slightly different food source.
Yeah, can make the difference over time.
Over vast amounts of time, yes. These small edges accumulate, generation after generation, leading to significant changes. He also draws a really important line between natural selection, which is about overall survival and reproduction, and sexual selection, which is specifically about competing for mates.
Okay. That's different.
Yeah, think of like elaborate bird feathers or big antlers on deer. Those aren't necessarily helping them avoid predators day to day.
They're about attracting a mate or fighting off rivals.
Precisely. Winning the chance to reproduce. It's another kind of selection pressure.
He uses that example of plants making nectar to attract insects for pollination. That seems like a clear win-win favored by natural selection.
Absolutely. A mutual benefit.
Yeah.
And he talks about the co-adaptation, like bees' tongue lengths matching the depth of the clover flowers they feed on.
How does that work?
Well, if some clover flowers happen to have slightly deeper tubes, bees with slightly longer tongues can reach that nectar better.
So those bees do better.
Right, they get more food. And those flowers get pollinated more effectively by those specific bees. So both traits, the deeper flower tube and the longer bee tongue, get favored, and they kind of evolve together.
It's just mind-boggling to think about the power of this gradual process acting over millions, billions of years.
Leading to, as he puts it, the beauty and infinite complexity of adaptations we see.
It's a slow, constant filtering and refining.
Driven by that basic reality.
Yeah.
Organisms best suited to their environment tend to leave more offspring.
Okay, so if the well-adapted forms are increasing, what's happening to the ones that are Um, Less suited. This brings us to extinction and divergence, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's the flip side of selection. As the winners increase, the losers, those less equipped for the current conditions, struggle more.
Resources get scarcer for them.
Exactly. Their numbers dwindle, they become rare, and eventually they face extinction. It's a natural part of this competitive process.
And then divergence of character. What does he mean by that?
Divergence is this tendency for descendants of a common ancestor to become more different from each other over time.
Why would that happen?
Well, think about it. If you evolve slightly different traits, you might be able to use slightly different resources or live in a slightly different way. You reduce the direct competition with your closest relatives.
Ah, like specializing, finding your own niche.
Precisely. It allows more different forms to coexist in an environment, like siblings taking up different professions instead of all competing for the same job.
He uses that diagram, right? With species A to L branching out.
Yeah, that theoretical branching diagram. It illustrates how one ancestral species, over time, can give rise to multiple new species, and then those can give rise to more, forming larger groups like genera, families.
Like a tree growing more branches.
Exactly. And he notes that the species most likely to sprout these new branches, new varieties, are the ones that are already common, widespread, and showing a lot of existing variation. They have more raw material to work with, so to speak.
So this whole process explains the way life is classified.
Yeah.
The sort of nested hierarchy.
That's his argument. The Linnaean system species within genera, genera within families, isn't arbitrary. It reflects this real branching pattern of descent with modification, shaped by divergence and extinction. It's a family tree.
But Darwin knew his theory wasn't without problems, or at least perceived problems. He tackles the geological record and imperfection head-on. What were the big issues with fossils back then?
Well, a major one was the seeming abrupt appearance of some groups in the fossil record. It didn't always look like a smooth, gradual change.
Like things just popped into existence.
Sort of. And there wasn't always a clear chain of intermediate fossils, what he called the interminable varieties, linking distinct species together. The critics asked, where are all the transitional forms?
If your theory is right, shouldn't they be everywhere? How did Darwin answer that?
He argued really powerfully that the geological record is just fundamentally incomplete. It's incredibly patchy.
How so?
Well, think about it. First, only a tiny, tiny fraction of things that die ever get fossilized. Conditions have to be just right.
Okay.
Second, the rocks themselves that contain fossils only form sometimes, in some places. There are huge gaps in time between different layers.
Right. Millions of years might be missing.
Exactly. And then things get eroded, or buried too deep, or changed by heat and pressure. Plus, species migrate. So just because you don't find a fossil in one place doesn't mean it didn't exist somewhere else.
So the lack of a perfect fossil chain doesn't automatically disprove gradual change.
That was his point. The record we have is amazing, but it's like trying to read a book with most of the pages ripped out. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
And he felt the overall pattern, the parallel succession of life forms globally, still supported him.
Yeah.
What's that?
It means that, broadly speaking, you find similar types of fossils in rocks of similar ages all around the world. Even if the specific species are different, the general forms of life follow a similar sequence of appearance and disappearance globally.
Suggesting a common underlying process.
Suggesting dominant forms spread, diversify, and are eventually replaced in a somewhat predictable pattern worldwide, consistent with evolution.
Okay, beyond fossils, he brings in embryology, morphology, and rudimentary organs. These sound like strong evidence, too.
Oh, they are. Really compelling. Embryology, studying how organisms develop before birth. Darwin was struck by how similar the early embryos of very different creatures look.
Like what?
He mentions the famous zoologist Agassiz, admitting he couldn't tell apart the early embryos of a mammal, a bird, or a reptile. They look remarkably alike at certain stages.
Why is that significant?
It suggests they share a common developmental blueprint inherited from a common ancestor. The embryo, in a way, shows us a less modified, more ancient state before the specialized features develop.
Wow, okay. And morphology, that's about structure.
Yes, the study of form. Darwin focused on homologous structures. These are parts in different species that have the same underlying anatomical design, even if they're used for totally different things.
Give me the classic example.
The bones in a human hand, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a horse's leg.
Right.
They're all built from the same basic set of bones in the same arrangement. One bone, then two bones, then wrist bones, then finger bones.
Even though one is for grasping, one for flying, one for swimming.
Exactly. This underlying similarity, this unity of type, makes perfect sense if they all inherited that basic plan from a common ancestor and then modified it for different purposes. It's hard to explain otherwise.
It's like they're all variations on an original theme. Then rudimentary organs, the leftovers.
Yeah, these are fascinating structures that are reduced, underdeveloped, seemingly useless in one species, but are fully formed and functional in related species or ancestors.
Like wings on birds that can't fly.
Exactly. Or the tiny remnant leg bones you find buried inside the bodies of some whales and snakes. Or our own appendix or wisdom teeth.
They don't seem to do anything useful now.
Right. Darwin argued these are vestiges, leftovers from ancestors who did use them. They shrink over time through disuse, maybe because they even become a slight disadvantage. He mentions beetles with their wing covers fused shut, even though they still have folded wings underneath they can't use.
So these aren't signs of imperfect creation, but echoes of evolutionary history.
Precisely. They only make sense in the context of descent with modification. They're like anatomical fossils.
Darwin also talks about the laws of variation, but he admits we don't fully understand them right.
He's very upfront about the ignorance surrounding why variation happens in the first place. He notes some patterns, like environmental conditions seeming to influence things like fur thickness,
Yeah.
and how parts that are homologous, like the bones in the arm and leg, tend to vary in similar ways.
He also makes a logical point. If species are just really well-marked varieties that evolved from ancestors, then the characteristics that make them distinct species should be the ones that are most variable compared to the older, more fundamental traits shared across the whole group.
Exactly. The newer features are often less fixed than the ancient, deeply inherited ones, like adding trim to a car versus changing the engine design.
That makes sense. And finally, he briefly touches on instinct. That seems tricky for gradual evolution.
Instincts are these complex, seemingly pre-programmed behaviors. How could they evolve step by step?
Yeah, like a spider spinning a web or a bird building a nest.
Darwin argued that instincts, just like physical traits, are subject to variation and natural selection. He suggested that even very complex instincts, like the hive bee's amazing ability to build perfect hexagonal honeycomb cells.
Which is incredibly efficient.
Incredibly. He proposed it could have evolved through gradual steps from simpler cell-building behaviors, with natural selection favoring bees whose slight variations in behavior led to stronger or more efficient combs.
And he pointed to behaviors in domestic animals.
Yeah, like breeds of dogs having an innate tendency to point or retrieve. These are behaviors, instincts that have clearly been inherited and shaped by human selection over generations. It shows behavior can evolve.
So pulling it all together, this whole book is just this incredibly detailed step-by-step argument.
Absolutely. From domestication through the struggle in nature, selection, divergence, fossils, embryos, structures, on the origin of species builds this comprehensive case.
A framework for understanding life's diversity, its interconnectedness.
And how it all arises through this slow, continuous process of modification, driven by natural selection acting over these immense geological timescales.
For me, one of the biggest aha moments is just that sheer interconnectedness. Realizing that things that look so different to us, a bat, a whale, share this deep history revealed in our bones in how we develop.
Even in those useless rudimentary organs. It really shifts your whole perspective, doesn't it?
It does. It's not just a catalog of different things, but a single, massive, branching family tree.
Constantly changing, constantly adapting.
So for you listening, if you've ever felt that sense of wonder, maybe tinged with being overwhelmed by all the life out there,
Darwin offers this incredibly powerful way to understand the underlying process. It's not about knowing every leaf and feather,
but about grasping the mechanism that shaped them all, from potentially one or a few original forms.
It encourages us to see the world as dynamic, not static, a constantly unfolding story.
And it leaves you in a pretty profound thought, doesn't it? Thinking about all this interconnectedness, this struggle, this selection. What kinds of subtle pressures, what selections might be happening right now all around us that we're maybe not even aware of?
Yeah. What evolutionary dramas are playing out that we just don't see on our human timescale? It definitely gives you something to ponder.